Hey guy, welcome back to All History. Tonight we're going to slip quietly into the streets of ancient Rome, where marble temples rise above the noise of carts and footsteps, where senators gossip in porticos, and where the lives of slaves unfold in ways both harsh and surprising. And instead of telling you all the things Roman masters did to their slaves, we're going to do something different. We're going to ask, what couldn't they do? Where were the limits, the boundaries, the rules that even in ancient times said, no, that goes too far? Because yes, Rome was a society built on slavery. Millions of people were enslaved captives from wars, children born into bondage, debtors sold to pay off what they owed. Owners held immense power, and many used it ruthlessly. But the truth is, there were some lines they couldn't cross, at least not without consequence. The law, religion, and society itself sometimes stepped in to say, even a master's authority had limits now. Don't imagine this as modern human rights. Rome was far from that, but scattered across dusty scrolls of Roman law, in the speeches of senators, and even in the quiet gossip of the streets, you'll find whispers of these boundaries. And if you lean in close, they tell a story that's stranger, more complicated, and a little more humane than you might expect. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the hum of Rome drift into your imagination. The crackle of an oil lamp, the murmur of Latin voices, the shuffle of sandals on stone. Tonight, we'll walk together into the world of Roman slavery, not to look at the cruelties, but to trace the lines where even Rome said, enough. So, let us start with one of the most surprising rules. Roman masters could not kill a slave without reason. Sounds shocking, right? You might think in a world built on slavery, life would be entirely in the hands of the owner, but Roman law placed limits. If a master killed a slave arbitrarily, he could face prosecution. Sometimes, if the act was public or particularly cruel, the punishment could even be severe. It didn't make slavery safe in the way we think today. A whipping, a public humiliation, or a harsh punishment could still happen without much question. But there was recognition that a slave was a person under the law in certain ways. Killing one without cause, that crossed a line. And Rome, pragmatic as it was, cared about public order as much as morality. Arbitrary murder could disrupt households, provoke unrest, or even lead to rebellion. And this idea of limits extended beyond just life and death. Masters couldn't strip a slave of every shred of dignity without social risk. For example, sexual abuse was complicated. Masters had immense power, but there were norms, especially if the slave belonged to another household or if the act became scandalous in public. Laws and social expectations sometimes intervened, not to protect the slave for their own sake, but to prevent disorder, dishonor, or shame from spreading. Even in the market, limits existed. A master couldn't simply sell a slave in violation of contracts or cheat other buyers. Roman commerce depended on rules being followed. Slaves were property, yes, but a property with legal recognition. Contracts, deposits, and promises had to be honored. Breaking these rules could cost a master wealth, reputation, or standing among peers. It's strange to think of it that way, slaves as property with protections, but that's exactly what Roman society created. Not out of mercy, not out of morality, but out of law, economy, and practicality. And when we peer closer, we start to see the boundaries etched in statutes, court cases, and everyday gossip. So as you picture the Roman household at night, imagine the flicker of oil lamps on walls, the careful eyes of masters measuring their power, and the quiet tension of limits that even in a world of domination, still whispered, some lines must not be crossed. Let's move now into the city streets and the marketplace, because boundaries for masters weren't only inside the home. Roman slaves often worked outside, running errands, carrying goods, or assisting in shops. And even here, there were limits on how far an owner could go. For instance, a master couldn't simply allow a slave to be publicly humiliated to the point of endangering social order. If a slave was beaten or shamed in front of crowds without reason, it could spark outrage or worse, rebellion. Public unrest was dangerous, and Rome valued order above all. A master's cruelty had to be measured, at least when eyes were watching. Legal protections sometimes came through contracts. If a slave had been loaned to another household, the borrowing master was bound by certain rules. Damaging the slave, overworking them beyond reason, or injuring them intentionally could lead to restitution or penalties. In some cases, even Roman courts intervened to settle disputes over abuse, showing that ownership had its limits, even in a world built on slavery. Religion also played a subtle role. Certain rituals and festivals offered temporary reprieve from punishment. Slaves could not be harmed during sacred ceremonies or public religious celebrations, or it might be seen as impiety, inviting divine wrath. So the gods themselves became invisible guardians of limits, reminding masters that even their power had boundaries. And then there was custom, the quiet rules of everyday life. If a master punished a slave too harshly, neighbors would talk, relatives would murmur, and reputation would suffer. Roman society, deeply concerned with honor and respect, often restrained cruelty indirectly. Masters learned to measure their actions, balancing authority with social perception. So as the sun sets over the Roman Forum, imagine the bustle fading, merchants closing stalls, slaves hurrying home, and masters glancing carefully at their households and streets. Power was theirs, yes, but not without limits. Invisible lines drawn by law, custom, economy, and even the gods themselves. Now, let's take a quiet look inside the kitchen and workshops of a Roman household. Slaves here were essential to daily life, cooking meals, tending animals, crafting tools, and cleaning endless stone floors. And even in these spaces, masters faced invisible rules about what they could and couldn't do. For example, overworking a slave to the point of collapse was frowned upon, especially if it endangered the value of the property. A healthy, capable slave was an investment, and ancient Romans were practical. Punishing someone beyond reason didn't just risk harm, it risked financial loss. A master might push boundaries, but pushing too far could backfire in ways that law, custom, and household economy would not ignore. Then there were slaves with special skills, craftsmen, scribes, teachers. Their abilities made them precious. Masters had to balance authority with the need to keep them alive, healthy, and motivated. Abuse that drove a skilled slave to injury or despair wasn't just cruel, it was unwise. Roman households, in a way, created rules for pragmatism as much as morality. Even punishment itself had limits. While whipping and chastisement were common, excessive harm or acts of cruelty without cause could be challenged, either by other family members or, occasionally, in courts. Masters learned to temper their actions, measuring discipline against the potential consequences, like whispers of gossip, legal trouble, or social censure. Religion and ritual again added invisible boundaries. Certain holidays, festivals, or sacred days forbade harsh punishment. Slaves might have temporary reprieve, protected by custom, fear of divine wrath, or social expectation. Even small moments of safety mattered, a quiet reminder that masters were not free to act entirely without constraint. So imagine the Roman kitchen at night, the smoke of fires curling up stone chimneys, a cook carefully stirring pots, children asleep in corners, and a master quietly considering what punishments were acceptable. In this world of strict hierarchy, even the harshest authority had invisible lines drawn by practicality, law, and tradition. Let's drift now to the world of Roman law, because it's here that the rules about what masters couldn't do become most clear. Even though slaves were considered property, Roman jurists wrote about boundaries and limits, often to maintain order rather than out of mercy. One famous principle was that a master couldn't act with total arbitrariness. If a punishment or killing occurred without cause, other citizens could bring complaints, and sometimes the magistrates would step in to investigate. The law treated slaves as property, yes, but property with certain protections, mostly to prevent disruption in society, rather than to protect the slaves themselves. There were also contracts and agreements. A slave might be hired out or loaned to another master. In such cases, the borrowing master was not allowed to mistreat the slave in ways that would ruin the property. If a scribe, a teacher, or a skilled artisan was harmed, it could be financially costly. These rules created an interesting tension, absolute power tempered by practical limits. Even the Roman Senate occasionally discussed limits on cruelty, especially when scandalous acts became public. A master who acted too violently risked legal action, social ridicule, or loss of reputation. Romans cared deeply about appearances and honor, and public outrage could be dangerous. So invisible boundaries were reinforced by social expectation as well as law. Religion, too, offered subtle protection. Certain sacred days and festivals were times when punishments were forbidden. Harm done during these times could be seen as impious, bringing social and spiritual consequences. Even in a world dominated by hierarchy, the gods themselves acted as quiet guardians of limits. As you imagine this now, picture a Roman courtroom, candles flickering on stone walls, a magistrate listening to a complaint, and the tension in the room as a master's power is quietly restrained. It was anti-justice in the modern sense, but it was Rome's way of saying, even here, in this world of ownership, some lines should not be crossed. Now, let's drift into the private spaces of Roman households' bedrooms, atriums, and courtyards, because even here, masters faced subtle limits on their power. While the household was their domain, social expectations, family reputation, and sometimes law put boundaries on their actions. Take sexual conduct, for example. Masters had immense authority over their slaves, but certain behaviors were complicated. If a master abused a slave in a way that threatened family honor or caused scandal, it could bring social disgrace. Stories from Roman texts show that gossip, reputation, and fear of legal repercussions often restrained extreme cruelty. Sometimes, protecting appearances was as important as the law itself. Even in punishment, moderation was expected. Excessive beating or public humiliation could backfire. If the abuse became too notorious, neighbors might intervene, or the incident could reach magistrates. Roman society, deeply concerned with dignity, order, and hierarchy, often imposed these invisible boundaries. Masters learned to measure power carefully, balancing authority with consequences. Some slaves had unusual privileges, often earned through trust or skill. Personal attendants, scribes, or tutors could enjoy protection from arbitrary harm, because their loss would be costly or disruptive. The value of skill, coupled with social norms, created another layer of limits. Masters could still punish, but not without consideration of the broader consequences. Religion, again, played a subtle role. Certain festivals or sacred times protected slaves from extreme punishment. Harm done during these periods was seen as impious, inviting both divine disfavor and social censure. The gods, in a way, were the invisible enforcers of restraint, quietly reminding masters that even power had lines it could not cross. Imagine now a Roman atrium at twilight, the soft flicker of oil lamps, a slave quietly carrying out duties, and a master pausing before action, aware that power has limits even in a world built on domination. Here, law, religion, and custom intertwined to protect the vulnerable in small but significant ways. Hey guy, let's settle in and wander slowly through the quieter corners of ancient Roman life, where the invisible lines that govern slavery become even more fascinating. If you imagine the streets, the markets, the atriums, and the workshops, you can almost hear the faint shuffle of sandals on stone floors, the low murmur of Latin voices, and the flicker of oil lamps casting warm light over faces both free and bound. Here, in these spaces, we begin to see not only the power masters held, but the subtle rules that even they could not break. In Roman society, slaves were everywhere. They served in homes, temples, markets, and fields. They were cooks, artisans, teachers, scribes, laborers, attendants, and sometimes companions. Their lives were defined by work, obedience, and constant surveillance. Yet, for all this control, society placed invisible checks on the master's authority. Let's explore the many layers of these boundaries. First, the law. Roman jurists and lawmakers did not view slaves as fully human in the way we think today, but they did recognize that slaves had certain protections. For instance, a master could not arbitrarily kill a slave. This is striking, considering how much power a master wielded. If a slave was murdered without cause, a magistrate could intervene, neighbors could bring complaints, and consequences might follow. The law acknowledged that too much cruelty could destabilize the household, the neighborhood, and even the broader social order. Slaves, in this sense, were not fully autonomous, but their value, legal, economic, and social, was recognized, and overstepping boundaries could hurt the master as much as the victim. Beyond life and death, there were boundaries in the daily management of slaves. Overworking someone to the point of collapse was discouraged, not necessarily out of compassion, but because a healthy, capable slave represented property and economic investment. Skilled artisans, scribes, and personal attendants were particularly protected in this way. Masters learned through experience and custom that driving these slaves too hard could lead to economic loss, mistakes, or rebellion. Even in punishment, moderation was often exercised. Beating a slave excessively or humiliating them publicly could provoke complaints, gossip, or legal challenges. Roman society prized order, dignity, and hierarchy, and excessive cruelty threatened all three. Family dynamics added another layer. Slaves often lived within the household and formed relationships sometimes complex with free members of the family. Masters could not act entirely without constraint in front of others. Punishment in the presence of children or guests was carefully measured. Abuse that brought shame to the household could backfire, disrupting both social standing and family cohesion. This was particularly true for slaves with special roles, like tutors or attendants to noble children. Their loss or mistreatment could have ripple effects, making it risky for a master to cross certain boundaries. Religion also shaped limits in subtle ways. Roman festivals, sacred days, and certain ritual occasions provided temporary reprieve from punishment. Hurting a slave on these days was seen as impious and could invite divine disfavor. Priests, ceremonies, and communal observances acted as quiet enforcers of restraint. Masters, aware of these spiritual rules, often held back from extreme acts during sacred times, not necessarily out of kindness, but out of fear of social or divine consequence. And then there was the marketplace and public space. Slaves who worked outside the home running errands, selling goods, or assisting in shops, were visible to neighbors, fellow citizens, and magistrates. Arbitrary cruelty in public could attract attention, provoke outrage, or even incite rebellion. A master's authority was absolute within the household, but outside, social norms and laws created invisible boundaries. Even gossip could act as a check, quietly reminding masters that extreme behavior had consequences beyond immediate obedience. Economic considerations formed yet another layer of restraint. Roman households were pragmatic. A skilled slave, whether a cook, artisan, or scribe, was worth more alive and healthy than punished or broken. Masters had to consider not just morality or law, but finances. Injuring or killing valuable slaves without reason was simply foolish. Economics, in this way, quietly moderated the absolute power that otherwise defined slavery. Let's also consider communication. Slaves often had networks of their own family members, fellow slaves, or trusted free persons. Rumors of abuse traveled fast. In some cases, public outrage or complaints to magistrates emerged, creating subtle pressure on masters to behave within certain bounds. Even in a system designed to exploit, these networks offered tiny threads of accountability. It's also fascinating to look at sexual conduct, which was complicated and often fraught. Masters had extensive power over their slaves, yet even here, social perception and household reputation could create limits. Scandals involving sexual abuse could damage a family's honor or reputation. Gossip, social expectation, and fear of legal repercussion acted as invisible regulators. Masters had to balance desire with discretion, punishment with social consequence. Another boundary existed in ritual and law. Certain ceremonies, festivals, and sacred occasions protected slaves from extreme acts. Harm done during these times could be interpreted as impiety, leading to social, legal, or spiritual consequences. Even in a world dominated by hierarchy and control, the gods, society, and tradition quietly enforced moderation. Masters were constantly reminded that their power had boundaries, drawn by custom, law, economy, and religion. Now, think about the quiet corners of a Roman household at night. The atrium is dim, oil lamps flicker, shadows dance across the walls. Slaves settle into their small quarters, performing their last chores or whispering softly among themselves. Masters may pace, weighing discipline, aware that overstepping invisible lines could have consequences in law, in society, and even in reputation. Power in Rome was immense, but not infinite. These invisible lines defined the rhythm of daily life, offering protection in small but meaningful ways. And then consider the lessons for us. Even in a society built on inequality, where cruelty was common, there were limits. Laws, customs, economics, religion, and social perception intertwined to form boundaries, reminding us that even absolute power is rarely without constraint. These layers, practical, legal, and spiritual, created a complex system where obedience was demanded, yet protection existed. however fragile or inconsistent. As you drift further into this story, picture the streets emptying, lamps burning low, and the quiet tension between authority and restraint. Slaves resting in their corners, masters reflecting on limits, and the invisible rules that held an empire's daily life together. It's a strange, intricate world, harsh in many ways but surprisingly structured. A world where the line between power and responsibility was never completely erased. In these quiet, detailed observations, we begin to understand that even in a society built on domination, the Romans had subtle ideas about boundaries, rules, and the consequences of overstepping. Slaves lived with fear, yes, but also with the faint assurance that some acts were forbidden, some lines uncrossable, and some protections, however imperfect, were always there. So settle deeper into your chair. Let the soft imagining of lamps, atriums, and Roman voices envelop you. The empire sleeps in your mind, and in that sleep, even the harshness of slavery is softened by the invisible hands of law, economy, custom, and religion. As we move quietly through the bustling streets and shadowed alleys of Rome, it's easy to forget that the life of a slave was not uniform. Some slaves toiled in harsh fields, sunburned and tired, while others moved through opulent homes, attending to nobles, learning the intricacies of household management, and sometimes becoming indispensable. And yet, for all these differences, the rules about what masters could not do remained surprisingly consistent. One of the most important limitations involved punishment. Masters were expected to measure discipline against reason and necessity. While striking or reprimanding a slave was common, excessive cruelty without cause could be challenged. Other members of the household, neighbors, or even local magistrates could intervene if they believed the punishment went too far. Roman society may have been harsh, but it prized order above chaos, and abuse that threatened social or household stability was not tolerated. Even the language of law reinforced these boundaries. Slaves were property, yes, but with recognized value. Unjustified harm could diminish that value, and legal disputes could be costly to masters. A damaged or disabled slave was no longer a productive member of the household, and the loss could be economically significant. Masters who ignored these practical limits risked more than guilt. They risked ruin or public embarrassment. Religious norms provided another invisible check. Certain days, festivals, and ceremonies demanded restraint. Harming slaves during sacred observances could be interpreted as sacrilege, provoking social and spiritual consequences. Masters, aware of these rules, sometimes paused, delayed, or modified punishments to remain in line with both social expectation and divine favor. Even in a world built on strict hierarchy, these subtle interventions reminded everyone that power was not unlimited. Within households, relationships created more layers of limitation. Slaves often formed connections with each other, with children, and with masters themselves. A master who acted recklessly risked breaking trust or provoking unrest. Certain trusted slaves, like personal attendants, scribes, or educators, were often protected by both social norms and household dependence. They could be disciplined, yes, but the extreme measures were discouraged because of their importance to daily life and the household's reputation. Outside the home, the public eye acted as an additional guardian. Slaves working in markets, shops, and streets were visible to the wider community. Arbitrary cruelty or abuse in public could provoke gossip, complaints, or legal intervention. The threat of public scandal kept many masters cautious. Social perception, combined with law and religion, created a network of constraints that quietly shaped behavior, even in a society built on domination. Economics remained one of the most practical checks on abuse. A skilled artisan, a knowledgeable scribe, or a capable field worker represented significant investment. Masters who destroyed their own property through cruelty risked financial loss. In a pragmatic society like Rome, the value of human labor was a compelling reason to moderate punishment and exercise discretion. Even in sexual matters, subtle limits existed. Masters had authority over their slaves, yet public scandal or harm to the household's reputation could bring serious consequences. Gossip traveled quickly, and the fear of disgrace often restrained extreme behavior. Discretion became a form of boundary, an invisible line dictated by social norms rather than written law. In quieter moments, slaves themselves found ways to navigate these limits. Knowledge of sacred days, understanding the temper of masters, and forming networks with other slaves allowed them to survive within constraints. These small strategist timing alliances and subtle negotiation reminded us that even in oppression, human agency found ways to exist. As the evening falls across the city, imagine the soft hum of Roman life, lamps flickering, distant voices fading, a master pacing thoughtfully, slaves performing the last chores of the day. The invisible lines drawn by law, custom, religion, and economy quietly guide behavior. Power exists, but it is measured, tempered, and restrained, even in a world built upon control. And as the city drifts toward sleep, so too does the story of these boundaries settle into your mind. Slavery in Rome was harsh, unrelenting, and often cruel, but it was not absolute. Even in domination, subtle forces of law, economy, and social expectation created spaces of protection, however small, for those bound in service. As the night deepens in Rome, the quieter parts of the city reveal the layered life of slaves and the subtle constraints on their masters. Not every law was written on scrolls, and not every rule was enforced by magistrates. Many boundaries existed in whispers, in social expectation, in economy, and in religious custom. They were invisible lines, guiding the behavior of masters who otherwise wielded near absolute power. Consider the household again. A master had the authority to assign chores, demand obedience, and even punish, yet overstepping could destabilize the very structure they relied upon. If a household servant was beaten excessively or treated cruelly in a way that endangered productivity or morale, it could ripple outward. Other slaves might resent the injustice, children might be frightened, and the overall functioning of the home could suffer. These practical considerations formed an important layer of limitation on absolute power. Slaves with specialized skills had an even greater level of implicit protection. Artisans, scribes, tutors, and personal attendants were vital to the smooth operation of elite households. Harming them excessively wasn't just unwise, which was costly. Masters understood, consciously or unconsciously, that the abuse of a valuable slave could threaten household wealth and efficiency. The invisible lines were practical as much as moral: preserve value or face the consequences. The streets of Rome added another layer of subtle constraint. Slaves who performed public tasks, delivering messages, selling goods, or assisting in shops were visible to neighbors, other citizens, and local authorities. Public abuse risked gossip, complaints, or legal scrutiny. A master's reputation was fragile. Excessive cruelty could diminish social standing and invite trouble. Social norms acted as a silent check, reminding masters that even their authority had limits in the presence of the wider community. Religion quietly influenced these limits as well. Certain festivals, sacred days, and rituals required restraint. Punishing slaves during these times was considered impious, potentially drawing divine disfavor or social criticism. Masters who ignored these spiritual boundaries risked censure and even subtle ostracism. In this way, the gods themselves became guardians of limits, ensuring that not all power could be exercised without constraint. Contracts and loans added further legal restraint. If a slave was lent or hired to another household, the receiving master was obligated to treat the slave within agreed boundaries. Overworking, injuring, or abusing such a slave could provoke restitution or even formal complaints. Roman law recognized the value of the human property in economic terms, creating yet another layer of invisible boundaries. Even punishment itself followed unspoken rules. Whipping, reprimand, and discipline were common, but excessive harm or humiliation without cause could be challenged. Masters were expected to act within a range of accepted behavior. Exceeding it could provoke complaints or scandal. Social expectation, coupled with law and practical wisdom, kept harshness in check. Slaves, for their part, navigated these boundaries with care. They understood timing, read the moods of masters, and relied on networks of fellow slaves or sympathetic free persons. Knowledge of sacred days, household customs, and social expectations became tools for survival. These quiet strategies, combined with invisible societal limits, allowed slaves to exist in spaces that were surprisingly structured for survival despite oppression. As the city sleeps, picture the quiet tension: lamps flickering, shadows stretching across stone walls, a master pausing before administering punishment, a slave quietly finishing duties, the distant hum of the forum fading. Invisible rules shaped by law, economy, religion, and social expectations softly regulate behavior. Power exists, but it is tempered, measured, and bound by layers of constraint that even the most authoritative master must respect. The night deepens, the city rests, and the subtle lines that define the life of slaves in ancient Rome stretch quietly across homes, streets, and sacred spaces. Even in domination, control is never absolute. Invisible hands of law, society, and religion reach across centuries to remind us that boundaries exist, even where power seems limitless. As the soft light of oil lamps flickers through Roman households, it's easy to forget that the invisible boundaries on masters' power shaped the rhythms of daily life in subtle yet profound ways. Slaves moved carefully within these spaces, aware of the limits their masters had to respect, and masters navigated the intricate balance of authority, law, economy, and reputation. It was a delicate dance, often unnoticed by the casual observer, yet central to the functioning of Roman society. One of the most significant boundaries involved life itself. While masters held the power to punish, kill, or sell at will, there were legal limits on unprovoked killing. A master who killed a slave without cause risked legal repercussions, economic loss, and social censure. It was a pragmatic form of protection. Society recognized that absolute cruelty could destabilize households and communities, which in turn could threaten the master's own position. Slaves then, though bound, had faint threads of security woven into the legal fabric of Rome. Daily discipline was tempered by practicality as well. Masters learned, through observation and experience, that overworking, overpunishing, or excessively humiliating slaves could backfire. Damaged, sick, or demoralized, slaves were less productive, less reliable, and less valuable. Economic considerations, more than compassion, often dictated limits on harsh behavior. The balance of power was maintained not only by law and social custom, but by the simple need to preserve the tools, the slaves themselves, that made household and business operations possible. Household dynamics added another layer of subtle constraint. Slaves often interacted with free family members, particularly children. Punishing a slave in front of a child, guest, or other household members could create tension, fear, or resentment. Masters, aware of the delicate equilibrium required to maintain authority and order, often exercised restraint in these moments. Certain trusted or skilled slaves, such as scribes, personal attendants, or tutors, were particularly protected by the implicit understanding that their loss would have cascading effects on the household's function and reputation. The streets of Rome imposed additional invisible rules. Slaves working outside, visible to the broader community, could not be subjected to abuse that risked public scandal. Observers, neighbors, and even local officials could notice mistreatment, creating the potential for complaints, gossip, or formal legal action. Public perception, combined with law and social norms, acted as an unseen boundary on the master's authority, shaping behavior through subtle social pressure rather than overt force. Religion, quietly pervasive, also created protective layers. Sacred days, festivals, and ceremonies limited punishment or labor. Harm inflicted during these times was considered sacrilegious and could invite divine disfavor. Masters who ignored these invisible constraints risked more than social consequence. They risked spiritual scrutiny and potential censure. The gods, in this way, acted as silent enforcers of restraint, reminding masters that their power was always, in some form, bound by rules. Contracts and loans of slaves added yet another level of legal protection. If a slave was hired out or loaned to another household, the receiving master had obligations to maintain the slave's health and value. Overwork, injury, or mistreatment could trigger restitution, complaints, or even formal legal proceedings. These practical limitations reinforced the invisible rules that surrounded Roman slavery, creating a framework in which authority was tempered by responsibility. Even punishment itself was constrained. While whipping, chastisement, or confinement was common, excessive acts without cause could provoke complaints or social scandal. Masters had to measure their actions carefully. The combination of law, custom, and economic sense created a system of checks on power, subtle but effective in shaping behavior. Sexual dynamics was similarly layered with constraints. Masters held power over their slaves, yet social perception, household reputation, and potential scandal often acted as boundaries. Gossip traveled quickly, and fear of disgrace or embarrassment restrained extreme or public acts. Discretion became a subtle form of limitation, demonstrating that even the most authoritative masters were rarely free to act entirely without consequence. Slaves themselves developed strategies to navigate these limits. Knowledge of sacred days, understanding the temperament of their masters, forming networks with other slaves or sympathetic free persons. These tactics allowed them to survive within the confines of their bondage. Small acts of negotiation, timing, and subtle resistance helped maintain a fragile equilibrium, showing that human agency could persist even under extreme constraints. As the city settles into night, imagine the quiet of Roman life, shadows stretching across stone streets, lamps casting soft light over sleeping households, a master pausing before action, a slave completing the last chores of the day. The invisible lines drawn by law, economy, religion, and social expectation regulate behavior in ways that are quiet but essential. Power exists, but it is measured, restrained, and bound by multiple layers of subtle boundaries. In this interplay of authority and limitation, we begin to see the complexity of Roman society. Slavery was harsh and pervasive, yet even in domination, invisible forces of law, custom, economy, and religion created pockets of protection. The night, with its quiet rhythms, becomes a mirror of these constraints, subtle, pervasive, and constant, shaping lives without always being seen. As you imagine this now, picture a Roman household at rest, lamps flickering, faint murmurs of conversation fading, shadows dancing on walls, a master reflecting on limits, and slaves settling into their small corners, invisible forces, the threads of law, the weight of custom, the prudence of economics, the authority of religion guide every action, creating a complex tapestry where even absolute power is tempered by consequence. As the moon rises over Rome, the city slows into a hushed rhythm, and the lives of slaves move quietly under the watchful eyes of masters. Yet even in this dim and controlled environment, there were boundaries that masters could not cross, lines defined by law, custom, economy, religion, and social expectation. These invisible rules shaped daily life in ways that might go unnoticed, but were crucial to the functioning of households and the wider community. Within the home, the invisible constraints on punishment and discipline were especially important. Masters were expected to act reasonably. Excessive cruelty could backfire. A household filled with frightened, overworked, or demoralized slaves risked dysfunction. Tasks would be done poorly or not at all. Valuable skills could be lost, and morale could plummet. Roman masters, pragmatic as they were, learned that extreme harshness was ultimately discipline had to be measured. Even in a system where obedience was demanded, certain slaves were particularly protected by necessity and social convention. Artisans, scribes, tutors, and personal attendants played critical roles in household operation. Their value, both practical and economic, acted as a buffer against extreme abuse. A master might correct or discipline, but the loss or injury of a skilled servant carried consequences that could ripple through the household. In this way, practical concerns created invisible boundaries that even the most powerful masters had to respect. Beyond the home, in the streets, markets, and workshops of Rome, invisible boundaries continued to shape behavior. Slaves who worked publicly were visible to neighbors, passers-by, and local authorities. Mistreatment in public could provoke gossip, complaints, or even legal intervention. The social fabric, attentive to appearances and reputation, acted as a subtle check on the exercise of power. Masters had to consider the potential for scandal or dishonor when acting, ensuring that even public acts of authority were constrained by social norms. Religion, a central aspect of Roman life, added another layer of invisible limitation. Sacred days, religious festivals, and important ceremonies required restraint. Harming a slave during these times was seen as impious and could invite divine wrath or social censure. Masters, aware of the spiritual and social consequences, often tempered their actions, showing that religion functioned as a subtle but effective guardian of restraint. The gods, in a sense, silently oversaw the balance of power, reminding masters that even domination had limits. Legal contracts and the lending of slaves introduced further boundaries. A slave hired out or loaned to another household had rights, in the sense that the borrowing master could not mistreat or overwork the individual beyond agreed-upon expectations. Legal action could follow if abuse occurred, creating a structured, enforceable system of protection. However limited, these practical and legal considerations intertwined, ensuring that masters' power, while extensive, was not completely unfettered. Even punishment itself followed a set of understood limits. Whipping, confinement, or other forms of discipline were permitted, but excessive acts without cause were discouraged. Complaints, social backlash, or legal intervention could follow, making restraint a practical choice for masters who wanted to maintain household stability. Social norms and practical wisdom shaped behavior as effectively as formal law, creating a network of checks and balances that moderated authority. Sexual relations were an area of complexity. While masters had the authority to act, public scandal, family reputation, and social expectation often imposed boundaries. Gossip spread quickly, and excessive or reckless behavior could damage the household's honor. Discretion became an essential form of boundary, an invisible constraint guiding even the most personal of interactions. Slaves themselves learned to navigate these constraints, observing sacred days, understanding the moods of their masters, forming networks with other slaves, and seeking small opportunities for respite became survival strategies. Within the confines of their bondage, slaves exercised subtle agency, working within and around the invisible lines drawn by law, custom, economy, and religion. These quiet acts of navigation remind us that even in oppression, human agency finds a way. Picture the Roman night now, quiet atriums lit by soft lamp glow, slaves finishing chores, masters pausing thoughtfully, streets hushed under the pale moonlight. Invisible rules shape the flow of life. Law defines limits, economy dictates pragmatism, religion offers sacred protection, and society observes silently. The balance of power is constant, delicate, and pervasive, ensuring that even in domination, authority is not limitless. And as the night deepens, the rhythm of the city reflects these boundaries. Masters move with measured authority, slaves navigate their tasks carefully, and the subtle forces of law, economy, custom, and religion create a structured yet quiet world of checks and balances. Even in a society defined by inequality and control, these invisible lines ensure that some protection exists, some boundaries are respected, and some measure of humanity persists amid the harshness of slavery. As the night deepens and the streets of Rome grow quiet, the layers of life for slaves and their masters become clearer. Even in a world dominated by control, authority, and hierarchy, invisible rules wove through daily life, guiding behavior and establishing boundaries that could not be crossed without consequence. These limits, often subtle, shaped how masters acted and how slaves navigated their world. Within the household, one of the clearest constraints was the expectation of moderation in punishment. While masters held immense authority, extreme cruelty could destabilize the very home they sought to control. Excessive punishment could weaken morale, diminish productivity, or provoke resentment. Skilled artisans, scribes, and personal attendants were particularly protected in this way, as their loss could ripple through household operations. The lines were invisible, but deeply influential, reminding masters to balance authority with pragmatism outside the home. The public sphere added another layer of subtle constraint. Slaves working in markets, streets, or shops were visible to neighbors, passers-by, and local officials. Mistreatment in public could provoke gossip, social outrage, or legal attention. Masters learned to measure their actions carefully, aware that their power, while substantial, was monitored by an attentive society. Social perception acted as a quiet enforcer, reinforcing limits even where formal law might not. Religion, woven into the fabric of Roman daily life, provided another layer of restraint. Sacred days, festivals, and ceremonies offered temporary reprieve from punishment or labor. Harming a slave during these times was seen as sacrilege, carrying both spiritual and social consequences. Masters often tempered their behavior in consideration of divine favor, showing that religion, while subtle, functioned as a significant force in defining boundaries. The gods themselves became invisible guardians, shaping the exercise of power in quiet but persistent ways. Legal and economic structures further shaped behavior. Contracts for loans, or hiring out of slaves, required that the borrowing master treat the individual within agreed-upon boundaries. Overwork, injury, or mistreatment could trigger restitution, complaints, or formal legal intervention. Skilled or valuable slaves represented investment. Harming them carelessly risked both financial loss and reputational damage. Practical considerations, entwined with legal expectation, created another layer of invisible boundaries, guiding the actions of masters. Even the language of social expectation reinforced limits. Gossip traveled quickly in Roman neighborhoods. A master known for extreme cruelty risked ostracism, ridicule, or loss of respect. Household stability, family honor, and social standing were intertwined, meaning that unchecked abuse could carry repercussions far beyond the immediate act. Discretion, prudence, and measured authority became essential skills for masters, navigating the delicate balance of power. Sexual dynamics were particularly complex. While masters held authority over their slaves, social perception and potential scandal imposed limits. Gossip, family honor, and the fear of public disgrace acted as constraints. Discretion and careful navigation became essential, showing that even in intimate or private spheres, authority was rarely unlimited. Masters often exercised subtle restraint to maintain reputation and avoid scandal, demonstrating that invisible boundaries permeated all aspects of life. Slaves themselves became adept at reading these lines, understanding the rhythms of household life, observing sacred days, forming networks with fellow slaves, and anticipating their masters' moods allowed them to survive within the constraints imposed upon them. Even small acts of subtle negotiation, timing, or quiet resistance became strategies for existence. These strategies highlight the resilience of human agency, demonstrating that even within harsh systems, survival often depended on recognizing and navigating invisible limits. As you imagine the Roman night, picture a household lit by soft lamp glow, shadows stretching across stone floors, a master pausing before action, a slave quietly finishing duties, and the distant hum of the city fading into silence. The interplay of law, economy, custom, and religion shapes every action, creating a structured world in which even authority is tempered, measured, and constrained. Invisible lines guide behavior, providing small but significant protections, ensuring that power, while vast, is never absolute. The night becomes a mirror of these boundaries, quiet, pervasive, and constant. Masters move thoughtfully, slaves act with caution, and the subtle forces of law, custom, economy, and religion form a network of invisible rules that regulate life. Even in a society defined by hierarchy, domination, and control, these boundaries persist, quietly influencing every interaction, every punishment, every act of authority. As the Roman night stretches on, the quiet rhythms of life for both slaves and masters reveal a world of invisible rules and subtle boundaries. Even in a society built on power and domination, these limits shaped daily life, guiding behavior and creating spaces of protection. However fragile or inconsistent, the invisible lines existed in law, economy, religion, social custom, and household practice, intersecting to form a delicate balance that kept the harsh machinery of Roman slavery functioning. Within the household, masters exercised authority, but practical considerations often restrained extreme actions. Over-punishing or harming a skilled slave could disrupt the household's efficiency, diminish productivity, and provoke unrest. Trusted slaves, like scribes, artisans, tutors, and personal attendants, were particularly shielded by necessity. Losing them could cripple the smooth functioning of daily life, reminding masters that authority, though extensive, had practical limits. Even punishment, while common and expected, was bounded by reason, necessity, and consideration of the broader household. The streets of Rome added another layer of subtle restraint. Slaves performing errands, working in markets, or assisting in shops were visible to neighbors, passers-by, and officials. Arbitrary cruelty could spark gossip, public outrage, or legal complaints. Social perception, ever attentive to appearances, functioned as a quiet enforcer, shaping the behavior of masters who wished to maintain reputation and authority. These invisible lines were not written on scrolls, but they were powerful, guiding conduct across the city. Religion, deeply interwoven into Roman daily life, provided yet another boundary. Sacred days, festivals, and ceremonies forbade excessive punishment or labor. Masters who harmed slaves during these times risked divine disfavor, social censure, or spiritual consequences. The gods, silently observing, acted as invisible guardians of moderation, even in a system designed for control and exploitation. Divine rules, custom, and spiritual expectation imposed limits that masters could not entirely ignore. Legal structures also constrained behavior. Slaves hired out or loaned to other households were expected to be treated within agreed boundaries. Mistreatment could result in restitution, complaints, or formal legal proceedings. Economic considerations reinforced these limits. A skilled or valuable slave represented investment, and harming them carelessly risked financial loss, household disruption, and social embarrassment. Authority was vast, yes, but measured by practicality and risk. Social norms further shaped conduct. Gossip traveled quickly, and a master known for cruelty risked ostracism or reputational damage. Maintaining family honor, household stability, and public respect required measured authority. Discretion became an invisible form of regulation, guiding how punishment, labor, and personal conduct were exercised. Even intimate spheres, such as sexual interactions with slaves, were constrained by social expectation and the potential for scandal. The invisible lines were everywhere, shaping behavior from public streets to private chambers. Slaves, aware of these boundaries, developed strategies to navigate their world. They observed sacred days, understood the moods of their masters, relied on networks of fellow slaves, and took advantage of subtle opportunities for rest or relief. Timing, subtle negotiation, and quiet resistance became crucial survival tools. Within these constraints, human agency persisted, allowing slaves to act, survive, and sometimes even influence the very masters who held authority over them. Imagine the Roman night now, the soft glow of oil lamps in atriums, shadows stretching along stone walls, a master pausing before action, and a slave completing final chores of the day. Outside, the streets are quiet, distant voices fading, while the invisible threads of law, religion, economy, and social expectation quietly regulate every interaction. Authority exists, but it is measured, constrained, and framed by countless subtle boundaries. The night itself becomes a reflection of this system, calm, structured, and constant. Masters exercise power cautiously, aware of invisible rules. Slaves act with care, navigating the layers of limitation. And the forces of law, economy, religion, and social custom ensure that, even in a world of domination, some protection persists. Some lines cannot be crossed, and some measure of order endures. In this intricate interplay of authority and restraint, we see a society that, despite its harshness, operated within frameworks of moderation and consequence. Slavery in Rome was brutal, pervasive, and absolute in many ways. Yet invisible boundaries, legal, economic, social, and religious created spaces where power was checked, order was maintained, and lives were subtly regulated. As the city drifts deeper into night, and as you imagine the quiet, flickering shadows of Roman streets and households, the complexity of these boundaries becomes clear. Even in domination, power is never limitless, and even in oppression, invisible threads of law, custom, and morality reach across centuries to remind us that some lines, however invisible, must always be respected. As the night deepens over Rome, the city becomes a tapestry of quiet lives and subtle rules, each thread woven from law, social custom, economy, and religion. Slaves move cautiously through households, markets, and streets, and masters navigate the intricate boundaries of authority, aware that unchecked cruelty could have consequences. Even in a world built on domination and hierarchy, these invisible lines shape daily life, influencing every decision, every punishment, and every interaction within the household. Practical limits on power are especially clear. Masters could punish, correct, or command, but extreme actions could destabilize the home. Overworked or injured slaves could slow household operations, disrupt productivity, and provoke resentment. Skilled artisans, scribes, tutors, and personal attendants were particularly protected by necessity. Their loss could ripple through the functioning of the household. The invisible boundaries here were not merely moral, they were practical, shaping behavior to maintain order and efficiency. The streets, markets, and workshops added another layer of subtle control. Slaves visible to the public could not be abused without risk of gossip, complaints, or scrutiny. Public perception acted as a quiet regulator, reminding masters that their authority, while substantial, was observed and judged. reputation mattered, and the fear of scandal could temper otherwise unrestrained power. Even in a society designed to exploit, the presence of others created boundaries that guided behavior. Religion continued to serve as a subtle but pervasive check. Sacred days, festivals, and religious observances offered reprieve from labor and punishment. To harm a slave during these times was seen as impious, inviting divine disfavor and social censure. Masters, aware of these spiritual rules, often acted with restraint. The gods, silently observing, became invisible guardians of moderation, ensuring that even in domination, power was never entirely unchecked. Legal structures further reinforced limits. Slaves loaned or hired out to other households had rights, in the sense that their treatment was bound by agreement and social expectation. Abuse or overwork could trigger restitution, complaints, or formal intervention. Skilled or valuable slaves were particularly protected because their loss carried economic consequences. Even in a system of total ownership, practical and legal considerations acted as invisible boundaries, shaping behavior. Social norms and reputation were equally influential. Gossip could travel swiftly through neighborhoods, and a master known for cruelty risked ostracism or public embarrassment. Maintaining family honor, household stability, and social respect required measured authority. Discretion became a tool for regulating behavior, a subtle form of boundary that applied even to private spheres, such as sexual relations with slaves. Masters exercised caution, knowing that extreme actions could damage reputation and provoke social consequence. Slaves themselves developed strategies to navigate these invisible lines. They observed sacred days, anticipated the moods of their masters, built networks of communication among fellow slaves, and took advantage of opportunities for rest or relief. Timing, negotiation, and subtle resistance allowed them to exist within constraints, demonstrating that human agency persists even under harsh systems. Even the smallest acts, quiet compliance, whispered communication, or strategic patience helped slaves survive and negotiate the boundaries imposed upon them. Imagine now the Roman night, soft lamplight in atriums, shadows stretching across stone floors, masters pausing before action, and slaves completing final chores. Outside, the city streets are quiet, distant voices fading, while the invisible threads of law, custom, economy, and religion guide behavior. Authority exists, but it is measured, restrained, and bounded. Invisible rules, often unnoticed, quietly govern every act of power, ensuring that domination is tempered and structure maintained. That's you picture this. The night itself seems to reflect the balance of the system. Masters move with caution, slaves navigate carefully, and subtle forces, legal, economic, religious, and social, intertwine to create a structured, measured world. Even in harsh conditions, protection exists. Even in oppression, invisible lines regulate behavior. The complexity of these boundaries illustrates a society that, despite its brutality, operated with unexpected subtlety, guiding power and restraint across centuries. That as the city drifts further into darkness, and as the hush of Rome settles over atriums and streets, the intricate network of boundaries becomes clear. Even in domination, authority is never limitless, and even in control, subtle rules shape life. Law, custom, economy, religion, and social expectation interweave, forming a quiet framework that guides every action. And in this complex system, even the harshest forms of power are tempered by invisible threads that persist through the night, ensuring that some measure of order, protection, and subtle justice endures. As the Roman night continues, the quiet rhythm of life allows us to see the invisible boundaries that shaped the lives of slaves and the authority of their masters. Even in a society defined by domination, hierarchy, and control, these subtle lines guided behavior, creating pockets of structure, protection, and order that were rarely acknowledged but always present within the household. The limits on punishment and authority were clear, though often unspoken. Masters could discipline, command, and correct, but extreme cruelty was discouraged. Overworked or injured, slaves could disrupt household operations, diminish productivity, and provoke resentment. Skilled artisans, tutors, scribes, and personal attendants were particularly protected due to their indispensability. The invisible boundaries within the household were practical and essential, ensuring that authority was exercised within the limits necessary to maintain efficiency, stability, and social propriety. the streets of Rome added another layer of subtle limitation. Slaves working publicly were visible to neighbors, officials, and passers-by. Arbitrary or excessive abuse risked gossip, complaint, or legal scrutiny. Reputation mattered deeply in Roman society, and the fear of public scandal tempered the exercise of power. Even in a system designed to dominate and exploit, the eyes of others created invisible lines, guiding masters toward measured authority. Religion played a continuous role in shaping these boundaries. Sacred days, festivals, and religious observances imposed temporary limits on punishment and labor. Harming a slave during these times was viewed as impious and could provoke divine and social censure. Masters, aware of spiritual oversight, often acted with restraint, demonstrating that even in domination, power was not entirely unchecked. The gods, silently observing, became invisible enforcers of moderation, reminding masters that authority had its limits. Legal structures further constrained behavior. Slaves loaned or hired out were expected to be treated within the agreed boundaries. Mistreatment could result in restitution, complaints, or legal intervention. Skilled or valuable slaves carried an added layer of protection due to their economic worth. Even within a society that treated humans as property, legal and economic considerations created invisible checks, shaping the exercise of authority and balancing power with responsibility. Social norms and reputation acted as additional subtle boundaries. Gossip could travel swiftly, and a master known for excessive cruelty risked ostracism or social shame. Maintaining family honor, household stability, and public respect required discretion. Even intimate spheres, such as sexual relations with slaves, were influenced by these invisible lines, as scandal or gossip could disrupt social standing. Masters exercised caution, understanding that extreme actions could have far-reaching consequences beyond immediate obedience. Slaves developed strategies to navigate these invisible limits, observing sacred days, anticipating the temper of masters, building networks with fellow slaves, and seeking small opportunities for relief or rest became crucial tools for survival. Subtle negotiation, timing, and quiet resistance allowed them to maintain agency within their constrained circumstances. These small acts demonstrate the persistence of human ingenuity and resilience even in systems designed to suppress autonomy. Now, picture the quiet Roman night, lamps flickering in atriums, shadows stretching across stone floors, masters pausing thoughtfully, and slaves finishing their final chores. Outside, the city streets are calm, distant voices fading, while invisible threads of law, custom, economy, and religion govern behavior. Authority is present but measured, constrained, and regulated by subtle forces that shape every action, ensuring that even domination has limits. The night reflects the balance of these boundaries. Masters move with care, exercising authority within invisible constraints. Slaves navigate their duties cautiously, aware of the unspoken lines that define their world. Legal, economic, religious, and social forces interweave to create a structured, measured reality. Even in harsh conditions, some protection persists. Even in oppression, invisible rules guide behavior. As Rome drifts further into darkness, the interplay of authority and limitation becomes clear. Masters, while powerful, are guided by invisible threads of law, custom, economy, religion, and social expectation. Slaves, while bound, exercise subtle agency within these boundaries. The result is a complex, layered society, where power exists but is never absolute, and where invisible lines quietly govern life, creating structure, order, and a fragile measure of protection even in the harshest systems of control. As the night deepens further, the Roman city grows quiet, revealing the delicate, often invisible threads that govern the lives of slaves and the conduct of their masters. Even in a society structured around dominance, hierarchy, and control, these subtle boundaries shaped behavior, protected some, and ensured that authority, while vast, was rarely absolute. Within the household, masters wielded significant power, yet practical limits constrained excessive cruelty. Overworking, injuring, or humiliating slaves could disrupt productivity, erode trust, and weaken household stability. Skilled slaves, artisans, tutors, scribes, personal attendants were particularly valued. Their expertise made them indispensable, creating invisible lines around their treatment. The loss of such individuals carried economic, functional, and social consequences. reminding masters that their authority was tempered by necessity. Public spaces added another dimension of constraint. Slaves working in markets, streets, or workshops were always visible to neighbors, passers-by, and officials. Public abuse could provoke gossip, social backlash, or even legal intervention. Reputation mattered deeply, and the eyes of the community acted as silent regulators of behavior. In this way, invisible social lines influenced even the exercise of authority in a world otherwise built on domination. Religion continued to impose its own boundaries. Sacred days, festivals, and religious rituals limited punishment and labor. Harming a slave during these times was seen as sacrilege, drawing spiritual and social consequences. Masters often acted with restraint, aware that divine oversight, coupled with social observation, constrained their actions. Even within a system designed to exploit, religion functioned as an unseen but influential guardian of moderation. Legal and economic considerations further defined invisible lines. Slaves loaned to or hired by other households were expected to be treated according to agreed-upon terms. Mistreatment could lead to restitution, complaints, or formal legal consequences. Skilled or valuable slaves, representing economic investment, were particularly protected. These practical considerations ensured that even masters with near-total authority were bound by economic and legal realities. Social expectations also shaped behavior. Gossip traveled quickly, and a master known for cruelty risked ostracism or public shame. Maintaining family honor, household stability, and social respect required measured authority. Even intimate interactions, such as sexual relations with slaves, were influenced by these invisible norms. Discretion became an essential tool for navigating authority, ensuring that actions did not provoke scandal or undermine status. Slaves themselves were not entirely powerless within these constraints, observing sacred days, predicting the moods of masters, forming networks with fellow slaves, and exploiting subtle opportunities for rest or negotiation allowed them to exercise agency within a restrictive system. Timing, subtle resistance, and quiet negotiation became survival strategies, showing that even in oppression, human ingenuity could persist. Now, picture the Roman night in your mind, atriums glowing softly by oil lamps, shadows stretching across stone floors, masters pausing before action, and slaves completing their final chores. The city streets outside are quiet, distant voices fading, while the invisible threads of law, social custom, economy, and religion quietly guide every action. Authority exists, but it is always measured, restrained, and regulated by unseen forces, creating structure and order in an otherwise harsh world. The night itself mirrors the system. Calm, structured, and pervasive, masters exercise power cautiously, aware of invisible lines. Slaves navigate carefully, leveraging small opportunities within constraints, and subtle forces, legal, economic, religious, and social intertwine to shape behavior. Even in harsh conditions, some protection persists, and invisible rules maintain order, structure, and a fragile sense of justice. As Rome drifts further into darkness, the complexity of these boundaries becomes evident. Masters, though powerful, are guided by law, custom, economy, religion, and social expectation. Slaves, while bound, exercise subtle forms of agency within these constraints. The result is a layered society, where domination is extensive but never absolute, and where invisible lines quietly regulate life, ensuring some measure of protection, balance, and order endures even in the harshest circumstances. As the night deepens, the city of Rome settles into a quiet rhythm, and the hidden structures that shape the lives of slaves and their masters become more apparent. Even in a society built on domination, authority, and hierarchy, invisible boundaries governed behavior, created pockets of protection, and ensured that power, while extensive, was never entirely unchecked. Within households, masters exercised significant control, yet practical and social limits shaped the extent of that control. Excessive cruelty, overwork, or humiliation could undermine household efficiency, erode trust, and provoke tension. Skilled slaves, tutors, scribes, artisans, personal attendants were particularly valuable, and their protection was often implicit. Losing such individuals could disrupt daily life, affect productivity, and diminish social standing, reinforcing that authority was tempered by necessity and pragmatism. Public spaces, from bustling markets to quiet streets, created further invisible constraints. Slaves visible to neighbors, officials, and passers-by could not be abused arbitrarily without risk of gossip, complaint, or social backlash. Reputation and social perception functioned as silent regulators of power, ensuring that even the most authoritative masters acted with some measure of caution. Invisible social rules intertwined with legal and religious expectations to limit arbitrary cruelty. Religion remained a subtle but pervasive force in shaping boundaries. Sacred days, festivals, and ceremonies imposed temporary respite from labor and punishment. Harming a slave during these times was considered sacrilegious, carrying potential social and spiritual consequences. Masters, aware of divine oversight and the scrutiny of their peers, often moderated behavior during these periods. The gods, in this sense, acted as invisible enforcers of restraint, ensuring that even authority designed for domination had limits. Legal and economic factors also defined invisible lines. Slaves, loaned or hired out, were protected by agreements and social expectations. Mistreatment could result in restitution, complaints, or formal intervention. Skilled or valuable slaves, representing significant economic investment, were especially shielded from extreme abuse. These practical and legal considerations ensured that even masters with extensive power were bound by consequences beyond immediate obedience. Social norms and reputation added additional layers of constraint. Gossip spread quickly in Roman neighborhoods, and a master known for cruelty risked public shame or social ostracism. Maintaining household stability, family honor, and community respect required measured authority. Even intimate spheres, such as sexual relations with slaves, were subject to subtle limits imposed by the fear of scandal. Discretion became a form of invisible regulation, guiding behavior in ways that formal rules could not. Slaves learned to navigate these boundaries with care and ingenuity, observing sacred days, anticipating the moods of masters, forming networks with other slaves, and exploiting subtle opportunities for rest or negotiation were essential strategies for survival. Timing, quiet resistance, and careful negotiation allowed them to exercise agency even within the constraints of bondage, demonstrating that human resilience and resourcefulness persisted under oppression. Now, imagine the Roman night, atriums lit by flickering lamps, shadows dancing across stone floors, masters pausing thoughtfully, and slaves completing final chores. The streets outside are quiet, distant voices fading, while invisible threads of law, economy, religion, and social expectation govern every action. Authority is present but tempered, measured, and constrained by layers of subtle rules. Power exists, but it is never absolute. The night reflects the structure of these invisible boundaries, calm, pervasive, and intricate. Masters exercise authority cautiously, slaves navigate their duties carefully, and legal, economic, religious, and social forces intertwine to create a measured, structured reality. Even in harsh conditions, some protection endures, and invisible rules maintain order, structure, and a fragile sense of justice. As the city drifts deeper into darkness, the balance of authority and restraint becomes clear. Masters, while powerful, are guided by law, custom, economy, religion, and social expectation. Slaves, while constrained, exercised subtle agency within these limits. The result is a complex, layered society where domination is extensive yet never absolute, and invisible lines quietly regulate life, ensuring that some measure of balance, protection, and order persists, even in the harshest systems of control. As the Roman night deepens, a quiet stillness blankets the city, revealing the subtle architecture of authority and constraint that shaped the lives of slaves and masters alike. In a society defined by hierarchy and domination, invisible lines guided behavior, imposed limits, and ensured that power, though vast, was never entirely unchecked. These boundaries were woven from law, custom, economy, religion, and social expectation, creating a structured world that balanced authority and restraint in ways both subtle and profound. Within households, masters exercised tremendous power, yet they were tempered by practical necessity and social expectation. Excessive cruelty, overwork, or humiliation could destabilize the household, diminish productivity, and erode trust. Skilled and indispensable slaves, artisans, scribes, tutors, and personal attendants were particularly shielded by implicit rules. Their well-being mattered not only economically, but functionally and socially, providing invisible protection within a system designed to dominate. Public spaces introduced further subtle limitations. Slaves visible in streets, markets, or workshops could not be abused without risk of gossip, social censure, or legal attention. Reputation was a silent regulator of behavior, and the eyes of neighbors and passers-by served as invisible monitors of authority. Even in a system of near-total control, public perception constrained actions, reinforcing boundaries that masters could not afford to ignore. Religion imposed additional constraints. Sacred days, festivals, and religious rituals offered temporary relief from labor and punishment. To harm a slave during these periods was considered sacrilege, bringing social and spiritual consequences. Masters, mindful of divine oversight and communal observation, often acted with restraint, illustrating that even the most extensive power was subtly regulated by faith and expectation. Legal and economic structures created further boundaries. Slaves loaned or hired out were expected to be treated within agreed terms. Mistreatment could trigger restitution, complaints, or formal legal consequences. Valuable or skilled slaves were especially protected, as their loss represented financial and operational risk. Even in a society built on ownership, practical, economic, and legal considerations constrained absolute authority. Social norms reinforced these invisible lines. Gossip traveled quickly through neighborhoods, and masters known for excessive cruelty risked shame, ostracism, or damage to family honor. Maintaining household stability, reputation, and social respect required measured authority. Even private spheres, such as sexual relations with slaves, were guided by social expectation. Discretion, prudence, and awareness of potential scandal acted as invisible but powerful regulators of behavior. Slaves, navigating these constraints, exercised agency within limits. They observed sacred days, anticipated the moods of their masters, formed networks with other slaves, and seized subtle opportunities for rest or negotiation. Quiet acts of resistance, careful timing, and strategic negotiation allowed survival and, occasionally, influence within a system designed to suppress autonomy. Human ingenuity persisted, even under oppression, revealing resilience amid constraint.